Shut up and sit down.
Hi guys, I'm Dodge, this is Bigmeks Workshop and Paint Studio, and this will be the last time we're doing the Leman Russ for quite some time now. We just want to paint it one more time as we stripped it down. We've gone for a sort of blue urban camo for this one. We were going to do a white camo, but it never shows up well on camera, so you can use these techniques from this video that we're going to use and apply them, just changing the colours ever so slightly. So you take the blues out and replace them with whites and greys. Before we get too settled into the video, yes, it's a plug by one of our local game shops, Composite Games. They offer 15 to 25% off. The website address is in the description, and if you follow that link and use the code Bigmeksarmy on checkout, you get an extra 5% off, so that's 25% off all your hobby supplies. Go check them out, and you can also buy our products on that shop as well. Just keep the plug short and sweet. Go check those out, and let's get straight back into the video. So I started with a black primer by Vallejo as always, and I'm going to use grey blue by Modeler. All I'm doing is putting on a initial highlight here. At this point I just changed my nozzle for a new one, so I was breaking that in, and as you can see my airbrush is playing up a little bit. Even though it's a brand new nozzle, I'm used to having my needle go through that nozzle a little bit further as it slowly pushes its way through the nozzle over time. And so the new one was a bit shorter, so I was being a bit heavy-handed on the trigger. But all you need to do here is highlight all the top edges. Obviously overdone it a bit there, but that's fine. Basically ended up giving it mainly a base coat, but you can see some of the black shades through there. Next is Games Workshop's Dark Reaper. And again, we're going to hit those very similar spots. We're just going to make the area that we're covering a little bit smaller this time. Also, I know that this is an airbrush paint, not everyone's got an airbrush, but I'd not used my airbrush in so long, guys, that I needed to get back into using it again, so I thought this would be a good opportunity for that. Now we're going to use Games Workshop's Thunderhawk Blue, and as you can see, that really starts to show up as a contrast against everything else. Now, what I should have done really is leave these colours till the very end, as these were the colours I preferred the most, and I do actually switch these as an extra coat at the end of the video, just to bring the blues back in. You could do this by hand if you wanted to. The same techniques would apply. You just apply it with a brush instead of an airbrush. And now I'm going to go in with the Negro Grey by Scale 75, and that's really watered down, and just put in that shading that I went over before, just to make it stand out a little bit more. It's going around all the inside edges with a fine cone, and bringing out that shade. Next, we're going to give that whole thing a varnish. That's kind of important, as you don't want to rip all your paint off. And then we're going to use Mascol by Umbro. This is really good stuff, you've probably seen us use it before. And we're going to paint on random patterns. And I'm putting these on quite thick. I'm putting a blob in the middle and then spreading them out, which is just the way I prefer to do it. We obviously don't want to cover the whole tank here, but it's a good start, and what we're going to do is keep coming back and adding more as we do other layers. It's obviously going to pay off to keep your pattern sporadic, and at this point none of them should really be joining. Then I'm going to give the whole thing a coat of Negro Grey by Scale 75, just to give it a nice dark base for me to work with. Because obviously we're going to paint another layer of colour over this now, and we don't want the blue showing through. We want a nice solid base for the other one. And I do like the Scale 75 colours for this, as they are very thin and go through the airbrush really well. Thick paint and Mascol will not work together very well at all. This next colour is Dark Sea Green by Model Colour. Sort of a bluey grey. I'm going to use that to just highlight the tops of the tanks. We're going to go around all the outside of the tracks, top part, and obviously the turret we're doing in the same fashion as well. I do go a bit over the top, but like I said, it's been a long time since I used my airbrush on a video, so you'll have to bear with me on that. Basically just picking out the centres and the tops of everything. Some people do these armour plates here the other way around and highlight these centres. I prefer to try and highlight the edges of them. And the beauty of the airbrush is you can go over it as many times as you want because the paint is so thin. Now we're going to use light grey by Model Colour to start bringing up those edges. Now what I did do on this was the same mistake I always make, and that is I didn't peel the mask off before doing this next layer. Right, sorry, I should finish this layer, then peel the mask off, but I don't. I keep adding more mask. The best way to do it is to do 2 steps like this and peel off the mask. Then do the varnish for both layers, reapply the mask over the bits you've already put the pattern on and add new ones to it, and then go back and do it again, take it off, varnish it, because that way you don't get the layers of paint trapped in between the layers of mask and it won't pull the paint off. Next is Sky Grey by Model Colour, and as you can see this is rather vibrant because at this point I've added more layers of mask, so we're just going for a nice solid coat. As you can see, we've got the purple areas of mask and then we've got the bluey grey ones that we've painted over. What I should have done, like I was saying, is pull off that mask, varnish, repaint it back on. If you want a really good quality tank, that'd be the way to do it. And now Wolf Grey by Model Air is going to be applied now. It's very difficult to get whites to show up on here, but the Wolf Grey is sort of a off bluish white, and I'm basically painting that into all the shaded areas to give those a little bit of depth. I think I'm painting them into the shaded areas, guys. I can't quite remember, and it's very difficult to see. I do change the background up in a sec with a grey background just to try and pick out the tank on camera. Now I'm just going to use Negro Grey, which you could just use on its own anyway to add those the bit of depth in and the shades, and just use the previous grey as a highlight. At this point I felt I was getting the knack of my airbrush again. It's one of those things you can pick up, get good at it, but if you leave it lying around for months and don't use it, you do forget how to use it properly. And then, as you can see, there's another layer of mask over the top of all that, and we've started joining all these up. Try not to overlap them, as that causes problems later on. Now we have Steel Legion Drab by Games Workshop, which doesn't really go through the airbrush that well, it being a base paint, but it is the right sort of colour, so if you've got something in the Model Colour range or Model Air range that matches, you can just use that. And also this time I decided that because we've just done the grey there, doing this will actually let the highlights bleed through with the pre-shade, so we don't need to do as many layers for this one. Now we're going to use Baneblade Brown as the highlight for this. And at this point I decided that because the colour you finish with last is going to be probably be the most part of the pattern, depending on how much mask you put on. So I did decide after this to go back and do those blues again, just to make sure that the blues were the main colour on this. Now to the big reveal, because when you're doing a project like this you don't know what it's going to look like until you peel the mask off, so it's kind of exciting to pull that off and see what results we get. And as you can see, some of that paint's actually flaking where I've layered the mask without taking it off, putting a varnish on, and then doing the next layers. I know that's a lot of work though. You can do it like this, and all those flaky bits of paint you can get a very soft brush and just basically dry brush them off. It's back and forth as a sort of clean up step, which is what I've done here. So we've got a relatively smooth paint job now, and we have some okay looking camo. Unfortunately, because of the way I did the mask there, not all the highlights stayed where they were supposed to stay because they were very thin layers of paint and they have been pulled off. Hence repeatedly telling you that it's best to take the mask off after each couple of steps and varnish. Well, that's what we've got so far. So the next thing I did was very simply take a large Games Workshop dry brush and some Screaming Skull, and just gently rotate that over all the edges. And a screaming skull can work as a highlight for anything. I'm not very good at doing dry brushes really. I thought it started to make it look a bit of a mess, a bit too dusty for my liking. If I wanted dust on it, I would apply that with weathering powders and stuff. But you can see that picks up the edges and starts bringing the shape of the tank out, which you're really going to need as we are doing a camo tank, and that's breaking up the shape, so you need something on those hard lines. If you don't like dry brushing like me, you can do it with an edge highlight, just a really fine edge highlight with a screaming skull or any very light colour, to be honest, which makes sure it's uniform all the way through. Now for the tracks, we are going to use Gunmetal by Model Air Metallic, and one of the reasons I picked this is it's a good consistency of paint and gives a nice coverage, and it's pretty much lead belcher for Games Workshop. It just applies a lot easier and a lot smoother. Basically I'm going to go around and I'm going to pick out all the tracks and all the other metallic parts. As you can tell, I blacked out everything else in the Vallejo primer, just to help break up the shape of the tank so I can have a look and see what else needs doing to it and what sort of colour palette I'm going for. And of course it's time to apply some null oil. I am using a wash brush for a change, and the reason I'm using the wash brush now is because the tracks are actually quite large and I wouldn't want to use a standard brush. This is only watered down 50-50 with water. I actually wanted it quite stark and I wanted it to sit in all those recesses. It's just going to save some time later on. Just be careful you don't drown it too much so the tracks go black, or that it spills off onto the work you've previously done. Now we're going to use Model Air Metallic Gunmetal again, but this time we're going to dry brush that over with a small dry brush. I'm not a fan of dry brushing, but I also didn't want to pick it out individually with a brush. I did want to get this tank done sometime this week. I'm basically just going over all the raised areas there, and it's not the greatest or sharpest dry brushes, but I'm basically just blending all those colours together with the shades underneath them, and we're going to come back and do some more work on them later. Now I'm mixing some steel by Model Air Metallic into the gunmetal and going back and forth instead of up and down. Well, instead of going along the tracks lengthways, I'm going widthways, and that's going to help pick out the edges, which is something you're going to need because those edges of the tracks right next to the blues, they need to have a sharp edge, otherwise it's going to look really flat. The circular motion does work for this, and I prefer to dry brush from further up the brush so there's not as much pressure on it. The further away from the brush tip you are, the less pressure is going to be applied, the easier it is going to be to get the dry brush where you want it. Then just to smooth all that out and get rid of any brush strokes, we're going to use a null oil again, but this is watered down a lot more, as you can tell. It's like watered down about 75-80% water, because I obviously don't want to drown out all the detail that we've started putting onto those tracks. So for the Aquillas and some of the other logos, I think, is it just an Aquila? There's an Aquila here, and there's one on the back of the tank I think as well. We're going to be using Balthazar Gold as a base. I wanted a nice rich, warm metallic colour to contrast the very cold palette we've got. Lots of blues, greys and whites on here. The only other warm colour is the Baneblade Brown, so we needed to break up those metallic parts, and Balthazar Gold seemed like a good base. We're going to start working that up as well in a second to a brighter colour, making it look even warmer. So next up is going to be Brass Scorpion, which is it's not quite a gold, but it's a very warm sort of bronze colour. I do like using this one quite a lot. Just be careful not to get your paint anywhere where you don't want it, and I've left the skull at the moment because that's going to get done later on. Now to bring out the details in the Aquila, we're going to give the Brass Scorpion an Agrax Earthshade wash. Now I've thinned this down a little bit, and you do want it to sort of gather in the grooves of the wings, but do it in several layers if you're not sure or you haven't got this technique down. because you don't want to drown the whole thing, so it's a dark brown, because then you have to bring it all the way back up again, or just go straight back over it again with brass scorpion. So I started picking out the details on the back of this. Is it some ammo hatch or something? I'm not sure because I don't play Imperial Guard, but we're going to use Caliban green as it's a base paint, and it's should give us a nice base, even though we've got different colours underneath them. So you're going to want to do 2 or 3 coats of this nice and thin to make sure you get a good solid coat of the Caliban green with none of the white or blue showing through, because we really don't want these details to blend into the back of the tank, as everything else is already designed to blend. For the skull, I decided to use a XV88 as a bit of a warmer undertone for the skull than usual, rather than using a morning fan. It sort of blends a little bit and complements the Baneblade brown, but it doesn't contrast too much either, as I think the brass scorpion draws enough attention to it as it is. Now I started picking out the Aquillas a little bit more, including the one on the turret, and that's a brass scorpion with a bit of Runelord brass added to it, because I didn't want to jump from one set of paints to another, so I thought I'd mix it to make that transition across the wings ever so more subtle. You want to get the 2 main top parts of those wings and then follow the rest of the feathers just on along the tips and the edges. Now for the lenses on the turret, I decided to start with a corn red. Again, trying to add some warmth to this palette as it's a very cold one. So from here on in, besides the armour, which is pretty much done, it is all warmer colours. Again, you want to be really careful with this. I'm using that looks like a much smaller brush than usual. Now I didn't want the lenses to match the bolt guns on the side, so I decided to go for burnt red by model colour, which is a sort of a cross between corn red and Wazdaka, somewhere in between there, with a little hint of orange to it. But it's actually quite a dark colour. It's one I find myself using more often. It makes a good base for this. As you can see, I've not done the metallic works on the bolt guns yet, but I'm going to save that till all the washes and everything are done for the reds. Now to carry on painting the lenses, we're going to use Mephiston red. And what we're going to do is basically take the top half of the entire lens in a diagonal line from the left bottom to the right top, and basically just paint in half a triangle. It's the easiest way to do it, and then just feather the details out. Just take the paint off the brush while the rest of it's wet on the model and just feather that out. Obviously you can add washes and everything to these once you're done to blend that work in, as glazing in that sort of area is actually quite difficult, it being so small. Now Evil Sun Scarlet is gone over again, and all we're going to do is the same process, but we're just not going to bring it back as far down the lens. And as you can see, the top corners are starting to brighten up a little bit and give the lenses a little bit of shine. After Evil Sun Scarlet, it's Wild Rider Red, which is much more orange than it is red. And this is almost just an edge highlight, just bringing in the top left corner a little bit. Yeah, I think I'm using a Winsor Newton here, 00 by the looks of it, which is a lot better for this sort of detail work. And you can pretty much call it quits at that point. And those lenses are pretty much done. You can always add a thin wash over the top of them. So the next colour is Xandri Dust. I should have been able to guess that one really without looking at my notes. But yeah, it's a really good colour for the skull, and you don't want to cover the entire skull. You want to leave some of that XV88 in the recesses, like the eye sockets and the nose underneath the skull. Now when it comes to painting these reds for lenses, I've not actually done one of these before, so I thought I'd muck about with this and show you how I was going to do that. Same sort of technique here, but starting again with the Mephiston red, No, this was a Mephiston red over a corn red. What I'm doing here is I'm just feathering from the centre, no sorry, from the left and to the right to the centre. Bit more of a sporadic pattern, so it's got a bit of a curve to it. So now I'm going to go over that with Evil Sun Scarlet after the Mephiston red, working to a smaller area. And the main key point of this sort of light here is you want the middle section to be the brightest. But because it's got round edges around it, you want to pull those out as well. You want to pull those out so you've got crescent moons around, and then it goes to a smaller sort of space, sort of like a Wi-Fi logo with a dot in the middle and the brackets around the outside. And after the Evil Sun Scarlet, it's a bit of Wild Rider Red. Again, doing the same sort of thing, but bringing that area in a little bit smaller. And now, as you can see, Wild Rider Red is much more orange. And we're starting to get a transition there that looks like it's got a hot spot in the middle and brighter colours around the outside, but more of a reflective surface. After that, I think there's only one more colour for that part, and that is Troll Slayer Orange. Very thinly down the middle. You can go brighter if you want and add some more orangey yellows to it. Or even, what I should have done really was just put Elementor's yellow wash over the top of the whole thing. And that would have really helped blend those together. But it's up to you how bright you take this or what colour you want to do it. You can also do it in blues for the lighting effects. But I was just mucking about with this one because I'd not tried doing one of these lights before. And we're back to the guns. I'm going to use Army Painter Red Tone to tone down that burnt red by model colour. Not that it's not toned down enough as it is, but I wanted a much more rich, dark red for this one. Again, I left the metallic work off this so I could just do these quickly and in a dirty fashion, and then I'll put the metallics in off camera later on because it's going to be the same metallics as everything else that we've done. At this point you don't really want to be adding too much extra to the palette. And now back to this crescent sort of reef thing. We're going to use Warg Flesh by Games Workshop. Working to the top points of each of the leaves, cloves, I'm not sure what they are, but you want to be covering about 50% of those. I'd still not decided what to do with those engines, whether to make them a different colour at this point either, but we'll get to those in a sec. So after that, the only thing really to do is to touch those up one more time, right towards the very tips, and that's a Warboss Green. You can overbrush these almost, letting all the other work that you've done sit in the recesses, and it should bring out that shape. The shape does actually catch the brush quite well. After that, it's a Shabty Bone on the skull again, and we're going to start picking out just the brow and the top of the forehead. The sculpt for the teeth for this skull pretty much non-present, but you can paint those in with a small Winsor Newton if you feel the need to. Now, I decided that the engines were going to be a little bit dirtier than the rest of the metallic work, being engines and all, but I didn't want to use a lot of weathering like I do with the Nurgle stuff, so I started with Model Air Metallic Black, which is a black metal. It basically looks like a gunmetal, no, chainmail by Games Workshop, or lead belcher that's had a null oil wash on it, so it basically misses a step for you, although it doesn't add the depth as it's all a unified colour. But I thought I'd just change the silvers on these ever so slightly. Now I'm going to use Oily Steel by Model Colour, as I obviously, not only does the title fit, it does give a very greasy sort of steel look, and that's what I was going for with these. The brushwork here is not superb, but it doesn't really need to be, as I'm going to put washes on these, and then I'm going to put oil paint on the whole lot as well, so the loose brushwork around those edges and those hard lines will disappear once we put the other layers and washes on. After the oily steel, we're going to add a little bit of iron breaker. I'm not sure why I decided to pick out the tops of these. I mean, it did show up on camera better than the back of the engine, but we're going to work around all those edges as well, and basically anything that stands outwards. So the sort of metal straps that are holding those to the tank are one of the main features there, leaving the engines actually much dirtier underneath those. Sort of add some high contrast to those sort of metallic parts. Now, Agrax Earthshade is going to be applied to the skulls. Now, this is very thin, as you can tell, because I don't want to flood the detail work. Just to add a little bit more depth to that and make it look a bit more three-dimensional. I'm not going to put a wash on that. I'm not going to put a wash on that reef thing, because the oil wash will do the rest of that work for me. Now I'm going to apply an oil wash to the engines, and at this point I'm not watering this one down. I'm actually putting a straight null oil wash on this because I want it to be really vibrant, well, really dark, sorry, over those vibrant metallics that we've done, to let the bright highlights become more muted, but in succession, so that it looks like it's blended a lot more than it should be because they're such high contrast. And that's, as you can see, is giving us a nice colour for the engines there that's a bit different to the tracks. Now, to edge highlight the guns, including the las gun on the front, it is just Wazdaka red on the corners. If you wanted to be a bit more fancy, you could do Wazdaka red, and then for the very corners of the guns and red highlights you could mix in a little bit of Rakarth flesh, and you get this off red colour that's a little bit more muted, and you can just bring that to the corners, just making them look a bit more three-dimensional. Next up is, well, in fact, the very last paint is just an Ishabti bone, again, over the bits that we've Agrax shaded, and just picking out the brow again and the top of the teeth. And that is pretty much it for this. At this point it's time to hit it with a varnish, and using a pin wash we're going to bring out all those details a lot more, and we'll have a look at that in a second. As you can see, after the pin wash, all those details are now pulled together, all that depth is now put back in, which is something that seems to have been missing the entire time, but don't worry, that we do that a lot in our videos. You'll see not much going on, and then the oil wash at the end will snap everything together and make it look pretty decent. I didn't put any decals on because I know absolutely nothing about Imperial Guard tanks or their logos. I also didn't put any weathering on, as I thought this video was already long enough. I would have just sprayed some weathering effects on the underneath of those tracks, and I possibly still could do if we were going to turn this into a studio army and learn about the Imperial Guard for battle reports, as this would match our board very, very well. So, do hope you learned something from this video, guys. I know I did. I made a few mistakes and didn't finish everything off fully on this model, but it was mainly about the camo pattern and the colours used to create that. So I do thank you all for watching, and we have a special thank you to our patrons as well, who help support this channel and help us buy these models. All the other links for our social media in the description. You guys know what to do. Hit like, hit subscribe, share on Facebook or on your social media, because that always helps our channel out. We'll catch you in the next one.